When you look at the geometry of the planet is a globe. And its exact geometry has been described as oblate spheroidal. And simply what that means is that it's a sphere, but the sphere is flat at the poles, at the two extremes of the sphere. It's a bit flat. And then it bulges at the equator. And that's because the Earth is rotating. So rotations tend to conserve angular momentum. And so you tend to have the middle parts trying to fly out and the topmost and bottommost parts trying to compress inwards. If you think of the rotation of the spiral galaxy or the rotation of the nebular cloud that formed the solar system. Okay? So these things are attempts at conserving angular momentum. But what it really means is that the Earth is a sphere and that the Earth is a living world. And it is very important to explain what this means. It means that on the Earth, and no other theater is known to behave like this. There are speculations that many theaters like this exist, but only one is known for sure. And that's the Earth. So the Earth has several processes that are very complex. And the complexity is such that you have creatures who are alive. Life is some type of dynamic process. And so you have creatures that are alive who have behavior independent or that seem to be independent of their environments. And then within that, you have a creature that is alive, but also self-aware, so that it is not just independent of its environment in terms of the behavior that it displays. Its behavior can be modified by its own internal referencing system. This is a tremendously big deal because it's like a miracle, really, but I'm not going to go into the details of what that miracle is because I have podcasts where I've talked about that. But in order to be able to generate this life and this self-aware life, it means that the environment of the Earth became complex enough, integrated enough, diverse enough, chaotic enough, robust enough, but ultimately beautiful enough that life can emerge from it. And it becomes so beautiful at some point that it is able to sustain the development and emergence of human life. Do you realize the type of stability and beautiful certainty, recurrent certainty that it takes to develop something like this? It's like a factory producing self-awareness. And the reason why the Earth can do that is because the Earth is relatively safe and stable in that sense. Its processes are integrated and conserved in some sense. So there is a sense of stability and durability over time. And the nature of the dynamic, because we can't see all of it because the Earth is a very complex system, but it is integrated with everything else in the cosmos. Because take, for instance, the Earth has a magnetic field. The magnetic field itself is generated from within the Earth. It means that there are processes deep inside the Earth that act as some type of dynamo, some type of electrical machine. And as a result of that, the Earth is able to behave like a magnet. And you would say, what's the importance of that? Well, that magnet, the way that it behaves, it radiates a field around the Earth. This field protects the Earth from the streaming radiation that is coming from the sun constantly. Because that radiation contains everything. It's literally just the power of the sun. You can imagine the sun as something that is screaming in space. I like to look for these analogies because you can think of it as something that's an engine that is just screaming and shouting at the top of its voice. That is the power of its nuclear reactor, blasting radiation all across the surface of the core out into space. Okay? Very powerful. So it is streaming all sorts of radiation from occasional slivers of gamma radiation to occasional flickers of X radiation, then ultraviolet radiation, infrared radiation, visible radiation. But the bulk of, even radio waves, but the bulk of the sun's emission is in the visible spectrum and the ultraviolet spectrum. The sun doesn't really produce intensities of X-rays continuously. Neither does it produce a copious amount of gamma radiation. Okay? The sun is well behaved in that sense because you have a lot of stars that throw up a lot of flares. Gamma radiation flares, X radiation flares, and these things, they are difficult to pattern into life because life requires the regularity of some type of behavior over time so that the carbonic capture and mimicry can pattern after those cyclical behaviors of the environment. This is what life is. Life is the carbonic capture and mimicry of the cyclicalities that exist within environments. I was the very first person to define this in the 5 principles of organized complexity. And I've long since been talking about it and developing it, because in order to understand human beings and where human beings come from or what produced human beings, you have to understand these things, because the way the human being looks on earth, the physical appearance, right, is patterned after the theater of experience within which that humanity emerged. So humanity that emerges in other theaters of experience, they are still humanity, because humanity is defined by a state of awareness. But the physical characteristics will have to blend into what that theater demands. So you will still have convergence in the area of the humanoid form, alright? But there will be topical variations here and there, okay? Because you are dealing with 2 theaters completely. Now, this magnetic field of the Earth is really what allows the Earth to maintain an atmosphere. Because without that magnetic shielding, the sun's radiation is powerful enough to strip the Earth of its atmosphere over time. That's what happened to Mars, okay? Because the Martian dynamo, the core of it, the thing that generates the magnetic field, it basically stopped working. And so the planet just froze to death. And it had no way of protecting itself from the constant stream of radiation from the sun. So the planet became sterilized. And without the atmosphere, there can be no life, because the atmosphere of the Earth, that's what generates all the complexities, the behaviors, because there's liquid water on the surface of the Earth. That liquid water is able to become an atmosphere because it evaporates. It becomes steam, or it becomes water vapor. And the atmosphere, what it does is that it moves water vapor around the planet. So it moves water around the planet and it falls as rain, snow, whatever. Now, what happens is that life, because life is a dynamic kind of phenomena, alright, the carbonic mimicry and capture needs a transport system that water provides when you begin to scale up life. Because in the 5 principles of organized complexity, which I wrote and published in 2011 and 2020, I describe the things that begin the patterning of life as prescriptive knowledge spaces, functionally specific knowledge spaces, because they are made up of functions. And the 3 core functions are transportation functions, control functions, and regenerative functions. That's how organized complexity starts, being assembled. Now, where any environment that allows these functions to operate consistently and reliably over time, life will develop there. And the life will be patterned after the local environment. I describe all of this for the first time in the 5 principles of organized complexity. Okay? So the environment and the water that maps into it, the atmosphere and the water that maps into it, they act like transport systems. And that way they're able to reallocate and allocate moisture around the planet. Well, if you look at it, the most moisturized places of the planet are the places where you have solar intensity. That is, around the equator. Why? Because the Earth, being a sphere, means that this equator is closer to the sun than the poles. The poles are constantly tilted away or towards the sun, but that's not the point. The point is that the sun's rays need to travel through a greater amount of atmosphere when it comes to the poles. So they hit the Earth at an angle, and that angular interaction attenuates ultraviolet radiation. So you have the most intense ultraviolet radiation from the sun around the equator, and as a result of that, because there's more heat there are more storms there are more phenomena of rain, so that the transport mechanism that converts water into water vapor, liquid water into water vapor, they are more dynamic in those areas. And because water is essential for life, you find greater amounts of life's diversity in those areas. And the entire behavior of the planet as it responds to these environmental dynamics, that the sun's heat heats up the water, it heats up the land, and these things interact complexly in an environment that is constantly dynamic. But what it means is that these patches of life, they don't appear uniformly all over the planet. There are some places where the planet exhibits an abundance of life, and there are places of the opposite where the planet exhibits an impoverishment of life, when almost nothing is happening because it's too difficult to have life there. The environment is too impoverished. And simply what that means is that the dynamism in the environment is too low, so that it cannot replicate the principles of organized complexity, at least not easily, because organized complexity is a dynamic. It's a movement. It's the way that things behave. It's a complexity that looks like chaos, but underlying that chaos is simplicity, order. Okay? Now, this behavior of the atmosphere of the Earth And the way that it is constantly reacting to the radiative pressures of the sun, that's what you call a climate. So when you look at the climate of the earth, there is only one climate of the earth. But the climate has localized experience all over the earth. So the climate in Africa is not the same thing as the climate in Europe, even though it's one climate. Even though you cannot separate the connections between the weather events in Africa and the weather event in Europe. They are all part of one climate. They always remain part of a single climate. It doesn't matter what the local variations are, what's going on in the local variations. If you alter significantly the local variations in one part of the climate, you will alter the whole climate, not just the local variation, because the atmosphere connects every part of the globe. Now, it also means that the way life forms appear on the globe, they map these local variations of the climate. So when you look at creatures that evolved in the climate of Africa, they are quite different from the creatures that evolved in the climate of Europe. Because for life to emerge, it needs to match the dynamism of its environment. First of all, the environment needs to be able to reach levels of complexity that we describe as organized complexity. Then if life needs to survive in that area, the creature needs to be able to match that dynamism if it's to survive. So creatures evolve to match the changes of their environments. They match to map themselves into their environment so that the environment can flow through them in ways that are cyclical, ways that end up generational. That's what you call evolution. And as the environment changes, the creatures change in response. Okay? But make no mistake, there is only one climate. Now, the same thing also applies to the human creature. Because the birds in Africa, for instance, they're quite different from the birds in Europe. But they're all birds. You understand? But because they must match the dynamisms of their environment, they look different. Their behavior may even be slightly different, but they're birds. So it's the same thing with human beings. You have human beings, but each one has evolved to match its environment, the localities of its environment, the climate. So I want to be precise about this. The human being evolves to match the climate that its ancestors evolved under. So the human being's genome, which is the long-term ancestral memory of the evolution of that creature. And in my podcast, The Biochemistry of Living Memory, the Physics of Blackness, I describe what this long-term memory is. If you haven't listened to that podcast, what are you waiting for? It's over 9 hours of absolute pure knowledge that is cutting edge. It's beyond cutting edge, in fact, because what you're listening to, it will never be supplanted. It will never be surpassed, meaning that there will not be a theory that will come and supersede it. And you would say, oh, doesn't that sound arrogant? It doesn't, because truth cannot be supplanted. It's either it is true or it is not true. Okay? So it's not like, oh, you have a theory today and tomorrow somebody finds a better theory. That's not the way that it works with truth. Truth is stable and steady forever. That's why it's truth. Okay? So if you haven't listened to this, you need to go and listen to it, because trust me, your understanding of life, human life, and everything is going to change once you listen to this. And you will also know the reason why the pursuit of white supremacy is an abomination. Because if white supremacy is real, there will be no life, especially human life. It won't exist. Okay, so it's easy for people to make the social argument of these kind of things, but they don't really know what they're talking about. They have no idea what they're saying. They're ignorant. Because if they really understood what they were saying, they would realize how stupid and foolish it sounds as it comes out of their mouth. Okay, but that's a different, I don't want to, go into that. What I want to focus on is the fact that because creatures look different as they pattern to different environments, these patternings, they are encoded in the long-term ancestral memory of the creature, but it's still a human. So the human that evolves under the climatic condition of Europe is different from the creature that evolves under the climatic condition of Africa. But even though it's still the same human, where is that difference? The difference is topical. Why? Because if you evolve in the frozen environments of, frozen lands, for instance, right? What happens? Then the creature needs to match the dynamism of its environment, the dynamism of its climate. Otherwise, it will not be able to survive there. So what typifies the climatic environment of very cold regions? Well, cold air is very heavy. Cold air, because it's frozen. It's denser. And it contains the possibility, depending on how cold it is, it can contain ice. And the human creature, like most multicellular creatures on this planet, they depend on breathing, aerobic respiration. They have a respiratory system that oxidizes glucose so that you can produce energy. So the primary instrument for that are your lungs, basically. So you need to breathe in cold air. Well, if you breathe in cold air, because it's heavier and it's colder, meaning it's carrying ice particles, you can't take much of it into your lungs because it's dangerous. So your body adapts and your nostrils become thin because you don't need much of it. Your nostrils become thin. Now, contrast that with the environment that is warm under intensity of the sun. Then the air is warm. Warm air is lighter. That's why, if you've ever gone into a hot air balloon, they heat up the air. As it becomes lighter, the balloon begins to ascend. It begins to float. So in that environment, because there's really no danger in the air, your nostrils become larger so as to be able to swallow and gulp in more air. And remember, this breathing process, that is the oxidation. That's the key to oxidation. What is oxidation? Oxidation is the process via which biochemistry generates energy. Now, that's the mainstream definition, but if you are tuned into the 5 principles of organized complexity, you realize that the production of ATP, which is the end product of this oxidative process, right, at least in one pathway, ATP is used to enforce and maintain organized complexity at a cellular level, at a molecular level, because the triphosphate, this is something that you gain from the biochemistry of living memory, one of the nuggets that are in there. The triphosphate that is in ATP, that is in adenosine triphosphate, that triphosphate is a representation of 3 6s. Okay? And it is used to pattern all the energetic reactions of the body. It's a signaling thing, really. Because after all, if you're going to maintain something, you have to be able to track it. You have to be able to monitor it. Well, that's what ATP is used for. But it's not just ATP. There are 4 nucleotides. 4 base nucleotides that are used in ancestral memory formation and storage. And that's adenosine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. Alright? So just like you have ATP, you also have TTP. You also have GTP. The 4 nucleotides, they're able to form these triphosphates. ATP is a common one that we know about, right? But what they are is that they are long-term tracking systems. That's how they code for long-term memory, because every biochemical process in your body is tagged either with ATP, ADP, or AMP. ADP is adenosine diphosphate. That's 2 phosphates instead of 3, because 1 has been used. Then you have AMP, adenosine monophosphate, because 2 of the phosphates have been used. Every time these phosphates are used, that chemical reaction that they are used in, it is tagged. That's how your body knows what that process belongs to. So there are 3 hierarchies of biochemical processes in your body. And you will never hear this anywhere else. The first time you ever hear this in the 5 principles of organized complexity. It's the breakthrough we're talking about here. That's why we're telling you that this is the future. Okay? So the entire biochemical systems of your body, they are creating memories. And ultimately, the equidistributed form of these memories, let me call it that. That's not exactly what it is, but let me just call it that for now. That's what's going to be stored ancestrally. So you can imagine that each human being, each creature, each living creature is carrying a book of life. And they are writing into that book, and they will pass over what they have written to the next generation. And on it goes. Everybody has an opportunity to modify the story in this book. But it's a long-term book because it's coming right from the origin. The history of the creature. When you are living on a globe, the type of memories that are being stored, they're really geometric. They're really some types of geometric invariants. I'm telling you, never hear this anywhere else. This is cutting-edge thinking. That's what your DNA is. You are storing the patterns of organized complexity. And so it's not just about, let me give you the secret. You are storing a record of what you are eating, what your ancestors are eating, what you are eating, and how what you are eating is being processed. But not just that, you're also storing where you are eating it from. So your body is tracking not just your relationship with your environment in terms of sustenance, it is tracking where you are on the globe as you are generating these data points. And it's using a GPS system whose datum or whose reference is the sun. That's how your body is storing the information that is passing over to the next generation. And every human being is doing this. Every living creature is doing this, basically. Because by eating, when you are eating your environment, you are sampling your environment. You are becoming your environment because your environment created you. And when I say your environment, I'm talking about the climate of your environment. You are that climate. That climate is you. Everything that the human being will come to know, including the nature of its self-awareness, it's all patterned after that environment. The details are what I explain in my podcast, The Biochemistry of Living Memory, over 9 hours long, of pure gold. Is better than gold. Alright? Because you've never heard anything like that before. Almost everything, all the assertions in that podcast, we're talking about things that are of such breakthrough in their magnitude of breakthrough, right? That what Nobel Prize, this is beyond all the Nobel Prizes. It's not a boast. It is what it is. Alright? Because that's organized complexity. It's a different way of looking at reality, but it's truthful. Okay? So each and every human that evolves in different aspects of the one climate, they look different. For instance, the hair. You go to Africa and you find people with stringly, curly hair. Well, it's down to the moisture in the air. It's down to the intensity of heat. Because it's all down to heat. Okay? If you go to the European climate and all that, or, the extremes of these latitudes, you find a different type of hair. It's the biochemistry that builds that. Because you need to match your environment. You find Africans with thicker lips. Thicker this, thicker that, bigger this, bigger that. It's because of the solar abundant energy in the environment, in the climatic location. Life is patterned after solar energy. It is solar energy that becomes adenosine triphosphate or any of the triphosphates. It's solar energy. You are literally mapping your relationship to solar energy. Because solar energy, it's literally a communication of organized complexity. And I'll explain why in a second. I already have an article on X. I've been trying to move the article to a YouTube podcast, but I haven't had time to do that yet. It's a very long article, okay? Because the sun is not just existing in the sky for fanciful purposes. No. You are mapping that sun as a biochemistry. That's how you survive. That's how you are. Okay? And remember, everything that you are, that is what is producing your self-awareness and your behaviors. So the fact that you have in these northern latitudes or the southernmost latitudes where it is very cold, you have people who don't have melanin on their skin. And simply, like I've said many times, every biology, especially human biology, is producing melanin. You have to, because otherwise, how does your body know what it's supposed to do? Melanin is basically the biochemical signature of organized complexity. What it is really, I explained in that article that I wrote on X. I'm going to transfer it into a podcast because my followers on YouTube, they need to have access to that information too. Melanin is something that I'm not going to go into here because it's too long. But if you've ever imagined what a biochemical miracle is, that's what that is. And there's a reason why your body produces it. In fact, the human embryo, during gastrulation, once it's able to divide itself into the 3 layers that it needs to start its journey, then it begins to develop a neural crest. That neural crest, right? Neural. It's the beginning of your central nervous system in that sense. Because that neural crest begins to manufacture stem cells that will build your central nervous system, your brain, etc. But one of the first things it does is that in addition to manufacturing the stem cells that build your nervous system, it manufactures melanoblasts as stem cells. They will differentiate into becoming melanocytes. Why? Why does the nervous system of a human being need to begin its journey by manufacturing pigment or pigment producing cells? It's because it's not pigment. You have been lied to. It's not pigment. It's something far more fundamental. In fact, it is the reason for everything. That's why it starts off at that very vital condition. Because people tend to imagine, the brain, the complexity of the brain makes you human. In fact, the entire point of anti-black racism is that black people are mentally inferior. How can they be mentally inferior? How can blackness be mentally inferior? When the first thing that the human nervous system does, the thing that actually generates the ability to be intelligent, is to produce blackness. So that's the kind of mismatch in the understanding that, when did racists ever depend on logic and facts? Okay? They create a lie, then they start working towards maintaining the lie and providing evidence for the lie. Okay? That's a different conversation. The idea is that those who evolve in much colder latitudes, alright, the evolutionary pressure is not on them to produce or synthesize copious amounts of melanin. Why? Because there's very low radiation in those environments, very low UV radiation. And it's not because melanin is a UV protector, like you would find as the common description in the mainstream. No, it's solar energy. Those environments, because they're very cold, they're very deficient in solar energy. Solar energy is literally the thing that life maps into. Remember, it's a dynamism. It's like a movement that you see in the environment in the way that things are recycled. So these frozen environments, those movements are very sparse because there's not a lot moving. Because it's very cold. Life does not have access to the abundance it needs to become as diverse as possible, to become as integrated as possible. And so the humans who evolve in that environment, they have to match that environment. Otherwise, they cannot survive there. Okay? And so all the phenotypic adaptations that you find, they are designed to match the dynamism of that environment. But your environment is what ultimately becomes your behavior. Because what is self-observation? Self-observation, self-awareness is that you are seeing yourself in an environment. You have to respond to the demands of that environment. And that simply means that everything you come to know in terms of knowledge is our interpretation of our environment. Knowledge is our interpretation of the climate. And so life in the very cold places of the world, ancestrally, the life is dialed down. It's attenuated because there's not enough currency, not enough energy. So everything is optimized, is streamlined. So what is sacrificed in that environment is robustness, diversity, because there's just not enough to create these things. So if life has to survive, then you have to dial it down. You have to strip it to the barest minimum. And those are the adaptations that you find. When you go to the other sides of the world, remember, we're talking about the climate here. So when you go to local conditions of the climate in places like Africa, well, you have a different situation, a contrasting situation. There is an abundance of solar energy. And that simply means that there is an abundance of life. Because solar energy is what patterns the exploration of life into spaces of possibilities. So these spaces of possibilities, they are what you eventually call the niches. The niches that open up, that life goes into, and the dynamic starts in there. So creatures enter into these niches, they become the representation of these niches, right? And then the dynamic starts on a different layer. And once the environment also changes, is modified, then the creatures adapt to these changes gradually. Because if the changes are very sudden, there's not enough time to adapt. You have a mass die-off. That's how it works in every environment. Creatures need time to adapt. So occasionally, the environment changes in ways that are very impulsive, and then you have extinction events. Okay? But the fact that Earth has been able to hold on to life for so long, and many creatures, many types of creatures, many variations have evolved, it means that there is a continuity. So Earth has not had the type of events that are so jarring, are so dislocational, that life just ceases all of a sudden. Okay? And that means that the big factors, the really big factors, they have been consistent. Like I told you what happened to Mars. The dynamo just stopped. The core stopped spinning. It stopped generating electricity, so to speak. The planet died. Okay? But you don't have that on Earth. And you know that it's been persistent and consistent for billions of years. Otherwise, the human being could not emerge on this theater. So in Africa, for instance, in the warm environment of Africa, you have an abundance of solar energy. And this shows up in the abundance of fauna and flora, the diversity of it all. The creatures have enough energy to explore different spaces. The environment is so integrated, dense, condensed, so diverse. Think of it this way. In very warm environments where you have a lot of solar energy, you can imagine an artist that has an unlimited amount of colors to paint with and canvas. So they just paint and keep painting, they just keep exploring. And within all the creatures, you find the sense of abundance, especially in the human being. Like in the human being that evolved in these areas, you find an abundance of physicality. You know, you look at the black African man or the black African woman. You are not seeing the result of limitation. You are seeing an abundance. Bodies that are big, relatively speaking. You are seeing, muscles that are bigger. You are seeing just an expression of something. You need to look at the African woman, okay? Look at the African man. Every aspect of the biology, every aspect of the anatomy, you are seeing something that is operating at peak efficiency. Almost like it's the definition of wealth, because nature has a definition of wealth. It's solar energy. It's the abundance of life. That's the currency that nature is using. And where these currencies are abundant, life expresses itself abundantly. And if you look at the environments themselves, because ultimately the sense of self that the human creature evolves is patterned after the environment. Well, that environment is very different from the environment that you have in the frozen places. So the type of thinking, the type of self-observation, the type of awarenesses that develop in these regions, they are also very different. Now, what typifies this? Okay? What typifies this? And that's the next stage of this conversation that I want to take you into. Because it's something I call the mechanistic thinking and the complex thinking. Because they are products of environments. They are products of these extremes of environment. But remember, there is only one climate. I mean, the fact that racism exists, let me tell you what racism is. Racism is the fact that human beings evolved under different climatic conditions. So racism says these are different creatures. They are different species. They are not the same humanity. This is a lie. Because when differences show up in nature, those creatures cannot interbreed anymore. That means that they have become different enough from each other that the bridge, the biochemical bridge between the two, it still exists, but it has been attenuated in some sense. It's like it's not a valley anymore. It's a very high mountain. So naturally, the two creatures cannot interbreed. But you don't have that in humanity. There's only one humanity because there's only one climate. Racism is the assertion that there are different climates on Earth that are distinctly different. Okay? But we know that that is a lie. Why? Because we can see it. It's a globe. This is what makes climate change an inevitable problem. Why? Because it was created by the erroneous understanding that the climate is many different things that are isolated from each other. And so naturally, by pursuing such an erroneous, ignorant philosophy, you damage the climate because that's not what the climate is and that's not how it behaves. So that the only way to be able to survive is that you must come together in a unified type of understanding, recognizing that the climate is one system. Otherwise, you are doomed because the climate of the earth is life itself. Do you understand what I'm saying? All the stories that you are telling and whatever you think is important, if that climate falters, all those stories have no meaning anymore. Do you think these types of problems emerged randomly? No, they are a response to a way of thinking that is what? Illogical. And I've told you that the reason for human beings, the reason why a human being emerged is because within the laws of physics, in fact, it's earlier than the laws of physics, within God, there is a kind of possibility of self-observation. That possibility is the reason why a universe exists. And then you have theaters of experience that evolve in that universe that create beings that are capable of observing themselves. That's the reason why it exists. Otherwise, there's no point. And that means that the human being is prescribed. And it is prescribed according to a singular function. It is to be able to observe God. That is, to be able to tell a story that is true about God. And since God is the ultimate goodness, the ultimate beauty, the human being is carrying the capacity to be able to tell stories that are able to stretch to accommodate the perception of this beauty. And since the manifestation of God as a physics is unlimited, so that capacity in the human is also unlimited. And every human being is carrying that because that's what it means to be a human being. That's why there's a one story. It is not dependent on your interpretation because you didn't create yourself. You didn't create the theater. You didn't create the physics. You didn't create anything. You're just observing them. Okay? So your opinion on this doesn't really matter. It is what it is. And that's the way that it really is. Okay? Very important thing to realize. And we are reminded of that when the climate begins to malfunction. You see, because the climate, the stability of the climate is really the stability of our self-perception. Because all our knowing and all our understanding comes from the climate. Example. What does it take to survive in a frozen environment where life is difficult? Life is less expressive. Everything is attenuated because there's not enough solar energy. What does it take? Life is harsh. The environment is pressurized. Creatures have no real opportunities for mistakes. You make a mistake, the environment will kill you immediately. Okay? Now, the amount of dynamism in such an environment is very limited. So you don't have an effusion of biodiversity. So it means that you don't have an effusion of biochemical processes. You have a scarcity. And that scarcity trains the human mind. Survival in that environment trains the human mind in the nature of scarcity. And everything the human mind needs to do to be able to survive in that environment, there's many things that were done that are unpleasant because of the environment. Because the nature of human civilization revolves around the sustainability of a food source. Without a sustainable, reliable food source, there is no civilization. And civilization is necessary because it is the faculty of that human being to engage the faculty that seeks that beauty. The reason why a human being exists. Because it's very difficult to start seeking that beauty when you are still under the type of pressure, survival pressure, that restricts your ability to be that way. I told you, I said, the nature of human self-awareness and the beauty that it seeks lies in the expressions of its narratives. The animals are very constrained in the type of narrative that they can experience. Their brains are patterned after that limitation. They are under consistent pressure from their environment. They can't do anything else. If they react in any other way, the environment will kill them. So they're under constant pressure, but the frozen environment is a similar type of pressure. It constrains the amount of narratives that can be told, the latitude of narratives. It's not a place that human beings are supposed to live in. That's why I keep saying that. I keep repeating that across many of my podcasts. The frozen environment, because it restricts the ability of a human to really be a human, and it forces different types of behaviors to emerge. The behavior must match the environment, otherwise the creature will not survive. Okay? It is from this environment that the mechanistic form of thinking emerges. What is the mechanistic form of thinking? You know what mechanic is? It's an oversimplification of nature. For instance, if you have to imagine processes, you think of them as mechanisms, individual mechanisms that are interacting with each other. Of course, as the interactions grow more complex, it becomes difficult to track them. But the idea starts from the fact that you have very simple pieces that now come together, they now interact according to mechanisms. That is not the way the human creature that evolves in Africa, that's not the way that the creature will think. The creature will not come to that type of realization. Why? Because the environment does not inform them of this. You have that type of environment in the frozen regions because everything is streamlined. Everything is literally down to its bare essentials. But in the African abundance of nature, that kind of thinking does not exist because you will never come across that type of phenomena in your environment. So where are you going to learn it from? Now, problem solving in the frozen environment is literally under pressure. You are pressured to solve immediate problems of survival. Always. The necessity for the invention is always focused on survival. Because if you don't survive till tomorrow, then what use is there having a long-term plan and a future? So the environment demands a very short-term type of thinking so that the solutions that are being thought about are solutions that can be utilized immediately to solve immediate problems. The African mind does not think like that, simply because it did not grow up under that type of ancestral pressure. The type of pressure the African grew up under is very different. I'll give you an example. You know, what is the nature of a biodiverse tropical environment? The thing that typifies this environment is the density of life. And what that density really is robustness, meaning that for every pathway, there are 10 other pathways that are trying to accommodate that pathway. It's so dense in terms of the movement and flow of information and resources. It's a system that is very integrated, very robust, very diverse. That's why you find the expression of life as a very diverse thing. That diversity is built into everything, including the living creatures, including the human being that evolves in that environment. Because life is guaranteed by the degree of robustness and diversity. Diversity simply means that everything is in you and you are in everything. That way, you are better able to survive and weather different types of perturbations. Because living in such close proximity with many creatures means that they are influencing you and you are influencing them. You have to be able to survive. Your body has to have a record of these creatures. Otherwise, one of them could possibly turn into a pathogen and wipe all of you out. Do you understand? It's organized complexities, the density of interactions. That's what you find in those types of environments. There are many creatures to be aware of. There are many examples of each individual creature. There's such variation that where is the mechanistic thinking going to come from? What is going to suggest it? There's nothing that is isolated like that. And so isolation or simple mechanistic processes do not feature in the consciousness, in the ancestral consciousness. So that the starting level for the thinking of how reality works is complexity. That's the starting level. Alright? Good. There are more I could say about this, but I'm going to stop because the podcast is becoming too long. Alright? Now, which is more useful? This mechanistic way of thinking or the complex way? Well, the answer lies in a simple observation. Which environment supports life? Greater abundance of life. It's not the mechanistic environment. Life struggles there. Why? Because life by its very definition is complex. That's really what it is. Okay? Your brain in your head is literally an example of organized complexity. So the mechanistic, very simplified models are not your natural way of thinking. After all, your sense of self is being generated by your brain. So the imposition of a diminished environment on the human mind is limiting. And the thing that is being limited is the ability to integrate into complexity. And that's why you have problems today in science. Because if you look at what science is, mainstream science, it starts off from the mechanistic thinking, classical science. Okay? Mechanistic, meaning the laws of motion, Newton's law of motion, because it found practical applications in warfare. Projectiles, cannons, guns. This need to kill things or to fight, it comes because of the limitations and the scarcities that are typical of frozen environments. Life is brutal in such environments. So there's competition for whatever resources exist. So people fight. They fight, they develop ways of fighting. And they fight to the point where, do I need to explain to you the history of Europe? They invent the means of fighting too. Because necessity is the mother of invention. You are basically just reacting to your environment. So you need to kill things because everything is trying to kill you in some sense, right? You meet people who are after the same things that you are after. Fighting. The development of consciousness in Africa is not like that because there's abundance. So whatever the reasons that people fight, there's so much of it that there's no need to fight. There's land, it's abundant. There are resources, flora and fauna. It's abundant. No need to fight. And so in the history of Africa, we don't find genocide after genocide. That is pre-European contact. You don't have genocides after genocides after genocides after genocides after, because what are you killing each other for? Whatever it is that is a point of contention, it is abundant. Okay? This is a very big difference. Now, it doesn't mean that the Africans did not have a pressure to innovate. Oh, they innovated, all right. And that's the main point of this podcast, is to give you insight into the nature of that innovation. But first, I need to describe to you what happened or what is happening to the mechanistic worldview. Because the mainstream science has moved away from the mechanistic worldview. Why? Because it's not a description of reality. It's not an accurate description of reality. Reality is more complex. And so you go from classical mechanics, and the end stage of classical mechanics is relativity theory, where people begin to understand the relationship that exists between different things, like space-time, for instance. Okay, but that's the limit of classical mechanics. And then you move into quantum mechanics, where you now realize that there is really no independence or separation like that in nature. You have fields and waves. And waves are continuous things in some sense. So now if you ask mainstream science for an accurate description of reality, as accurate as mainstream science knows, then it begins to introduce you to quantum field theories. That is, spaces of possibilities that have mechanisms in them. So there are mechanisms for field interactions, for instance. You have gauge theories that describe the way that these fields behave. But what is it really? You are talking about complexity. It's what makes quantum mechanics unusual from the mechanistic point of thinking, because now you are approaching a clearer description of the way that reality itself actually operates. Why does reality operate this way? Because without that perspective, you have no life. Life is complex, and it is complexly organized. It's the reason why I coined the term complexly evolving ensembles. I coined this term, I wrote about it in my book, The 5 Principles of Organized Complexity, published in 2011 and 2020. And then the whole world, the whole academia began to start stealing this from me. They refused to recognize my work, and then they began to rename all my ideas and my inventions in my book and to pass it off as their own. Now, I'm not going to go into all that because obviously it's extremely apparent. I even have a pinned tweet on my profile on Twitter, on X, right? My pinned tweet is about that. It's one of the most blatant theft of knowledge. Very blatant. It's almost like, we don't care. Okay? And then they give themselves credit for all these things. These are my inventions. They came from me. They're very personal to me. But so the mechanistic form of thinking has had to evolve, because the more you know, the more you realize that nature is not that simple. Nature is an integrated whole, and that means connections. Well, the basis of connection, that's how the African mentality starts. That's where it actually starts from. So that the other type of mentality, the mechanistic, it had to start from below that to come to the realization that nature is complex. But the African form of thinking started already from complexity. Why? Because your environment is complex. You live in an environment that is extremely complex. You have different types of creatures interacting with each other continuously, dynamically. You are that environment. Your behaviors will come from that environment, because the environment is the only theater that you know. That's where you learn from. So everything you are going to learn is going to carry that complexity. The only way you'll be able to understand anything is if you understand it in that form that that environment presents it. And so the types of tools, the types of inventions that the Africans can invent, they will reflect that complexity. Because if you think that people can live in an environment and remain stupid, then you are just an idiot. And you are an idiot because you want to be an idiot. Because the idea of self-awareness simply means that you are patterned. You are responding to your environment in a way that you are aware of. So the environment is what is reinforcing your self-awareness. So that reinforced self-awareness, that's what you call learning. You are reacting and you are observing your reactions. That's what you call learning. That's why I call the earth a theater of experience. Only racists come to the conclusion that a people can live in an environment ancestrally and then emerge from it without even having conception of a will. I mean, this is like, I don't, listen, I come across many types of people like this, especially on social media. I don't know what to say to them. Because it's not just about being disgusted. It's how can a human being even sit with this type of awareness? Because that type of awareness you are sitting with is evidence that something is wrong with you. Because there is no logic, there is no way to arrive at that type of conclusion in your mind. So basically, that type of conclusion is a conclusion that you are holding without ever investigating whether it is true or not. That is the height of stupidity. And so how can a human being who is built to internalize the most beautiful truths in the universe, how can a human being rest with that? So Africans evolved to understand complexity, complex thinking. And there's a reason why. It's down to that thing called melanin. Because living in the solar-rich environment, the sun makes you black. And simply, the way the sun does that is that it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on your biochemistry, forcing it to respond. Now, your biochemistry has to respond to the environment. Otherwise, the environment will kill you. That's the way that it works. It's a theater. It demands you respond. That's what it is. Okay? But the idea is that the response and the demand is balanced over time because it is the will of God. Okay? That demand and response is the pressure that made the human being to come out of the animal kingdom. The moment the human being became self-aware, it was an arrival of some kind because it's God that is traveling through the dynamic. When it emerges into self-awareness, then it looks back and it sees its journey, that it has emerged from it, meaning it's like emerging from a cocoon. I mean, a woman gives birth to a child. Well, the child is not the mother. Okay? Each generation of human, each generation of creature is carrying an adaptation of some kind to an environment. So the idea is that each generation is better because the journey is towards organized complexity, biochemically and in your mind as your consciousness. Okay? These are very important things. Now, the human creature that evolved under the pressure of the sun, just like you have people that evolved under the pressure of an ice age or a frozen environment, if they don't react in a certain kind of way, the environment will kill them. But you also have people who evolve under the pressure of the sun. And if you've not seen melanoma or other types of cancers, then you don't understand the sun will kill you if you don't have a response to it. Now, the human creature that evolved under this, they evolved to match the dynamics of their environment, including the sun. The solution for that is blackness. Because it's not a solution. It's the thing that has been traveling through the dynamic of humanity, through the dynamic of the animal kingdom to emerge as humanity. So that when the human first recognized its own self-awareness, it was black. There's a reason why. That's the reason why I call it a transport system. It emerged. Okay? It's a condition. It's a necessary condition for the emergence of self-awareness. Listen, I don't hate anybody, alright? But there's a reason why I say the things that I say. They are based on truth. And truth is love. That's really what it is. It's an act of love. Even though truth-sayers are very much hated, okay? But it's an act of love. Because I'm showing you what the reality is. And remember, what the reality is not down to your opinion. It is being written on a level that is cosmic because it's written by the universe. So it's written by God. So what difference does it make if somebody is deciding that they're not going to pay attention to? Who cares? If you have to build an airplane, you have to pay attention to the fact that gravity will try to bring it to the ground. So if you decide that you're not going to pay attention to gravity, that's your own problem. The challenge of humanity is to recognize what it is. That's the only way that we survive. We all survive. Because if we don't do that, and you're squabbling and pursuing all these nonsensical things, then how are you going to survive? You won't even know what is going on. So how are you going to survive? Under the immense pressure of the sun, the black African began to produce melanin. Now, the potential for that melanin was already there. And I have a podcast where I talk about blackness being the trigger for civilization, for self-awareness. Because after all, the early hominid, it lost its fur because the nervous system started to become very, very complex.
The spinal cord began to go into its well-known S shape.
Self-awareness means that you must walk erect. You must stand erect. I can go into all the reasons why this is a prerequisite, but I prefer not to because it's going to be too long, okay? And the fur disappeared from the body. Well, the fur disappearing from the body means that the dermis, if you take a baboon or a monkey and you shave off all its fur, the skin is very pale, okay? Because that skin, that epidermis, it doesn't really contact the sun. It's protected by the fur. So the biochemistry needs to synthesize something that can protect the dermis, because the dermis, it's prone to radiation because that's what the sun is pouring out. So the biochemistry synthesizes epidermal melanin. And there's a reason why. I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, but it's in that my article on X. Okay? And this change in the appearance of the creature driven by exposure to the sun, that is the trigger for self-awareness. Okay, there are other things involved, but that's the primary trigger. Self-awareness, it's lit up by the sun, literally. And it is from that you have civilization. It's why the ancient black Africans, they built civilizations around the reality of the sun. It's not because they were worshipping the sun, it's science, it's physics. When you understand the physics, you understand what is important, you understand what is valuable. That's the way that it is. Okay? The idea of primitivity and listen, the world is not the way that you think it is, and history is not the way that you think it is. That's why I always encourage people to reflect, because there is no mystery that God cannot reveal the answer to you, but you can't approach God as a falsehood or with falsehoods. It's not just possible. You won't even be able to, because the majesty of God is beyond your perception, really. It's beyond anything that you can imagine. Okay? And so the creature that is not able to approach the majesty of God for questions and answers or whatever, the creature is hiding. Because it feels like it's under accusation. Why? Well, the Torah narrative. Adam, where are you? So I'm hiding. Why? Because your perception has changed. You have become a bit dimmer in your consciousness. Okay? And that's where denial comes from. Because the origin of evil. Listen to this. When self-consciousness arises, then it conveys the ability to tell different types of stories, so that you stop remembering that there is only one story. Now you have latitude. You call that latitude free will, agency. All right? But agency and free will doesn't mean that there are different types of realities. No, there's only one reality, only one story. It's the physics of God, the reality of God, the knowledge of God. That's what is being expressed. If you lose sight of that, then you're on your own. You're out at sea, basically. Okay? And if you continue to deny, you find yourself so lost, so far away from everything. Okay? It's a very, very important thing. That's why I have a podcast called The One Story. Okay? Now, melanin is the biochemical representation of something that is, I can say it's organized complexity, but the truth is, how does that convey the significance of what I'm trying to describe here? Okay? It's a polymer. But it's a polymer, like a material unlike anything that is known in terms of ix behavior. There's melanin all over your body, from your brain, your spinal cord, your lungs, every major organ in your body. And in the human being, there's melanin in the central nervous system in copious amounts. There's no other creature on this planet that has that level of melanin in their central nervous system. Why? There's no other creature on this planet that is self-aware. So it must mean something, and it does mean something. It's a qualification. Because I've told you, I said that blackness is the only manifest destiny, the only real manifest destiny. God uses it to guide the long-term evolutionary dynamics of everything into infinity. God directed the emergence of a human being on planet Earth, and he did it with blackness. If you want to understand all the details, listen to the Biochemistry of Living Memory or read my book. There is nothing that is known that can do that. In other words, what I'm telling you is that there is no uncertainty or degree of chaos that blackness cannot bring into order, either as a biochemistry or as anything else. Because that blackness is a representation of organized complexity. And because 6 and the multiples of 6s, they track every prime position to infinity. And primes, the way that they appear in the number on a one-dimensional line, they are infinitely novel, meaning they're always surprising, meaning they really have no pattern in that sense. Yet, the 6s, they track all the primes. So by knowing where the 6s are, you know where all the primes are. So you can take something that is as chaotic as primes and you can bring them into order. The order itself is blackness. That's why things are black. Now, anywhere in the biochemistry where things are tending towards novelty, things are changing in ways that approach limits of chaos, that place starts appearing black. If it's not, the thing will become cancerous. It will become crazy. There's no control system for it. It will go insane. That is the reason why on your skin is being the early epidermis of the early hominid that had lost its fur. The skin started to be bombarded by the radiation from the sun. The radiation from the sun is largely chaotic. So you need a system that can somehow attenuate this radiation, make it less harmful. Voila, that's the solution. because that's what blackness does. Wherever there's chaos, well, introduce blackness in there. It will find a solution. Do you understand what I'm talking about here? Because what I'm talking about here is extremely powerful. And the only way that it does not resonate with you is because you are in denial. Everything I'm saying here is verifiably true. In fact, I came across a mainstream article the other day that says that melanin is now recognized as the 4th bioorganic polymer. That's mainstream science, basically, coming to terms with something that it has already known for a very long time. But it was not politically correct to state it. Why? Because the world is the world that is pursuing white supremacy. Okay? So all the truths regarding what is really going on, regarding the truth of blackness, everything is denied. Everything is attenuated just to give it no significance. And so a socio-cultural environment is now pursued. It's invented and pursued to make sure that blackness has no significance. In fact, it's worse than that. It's to make sure that blackness now has a significance that you attach to nonsense, to evil, to ignorance, to rubbish, to intellectual inferiority, etc., etc. That's like a decoupling from reality. Because no matter how long you believe such a thing, no matter how long you manufacture such a thing, no matter how long you broadcast such a thing, it will never be true. And the fact that it will never be true is the only reason why you are alive. It doesn't matter what you are. Blackness is necessary to keep you alive. If you are self-aware, it is necessary to keep you self-aware. So if your accusations against blackness are really true, then you should be dead. You should not even exist in the first place. So that the accusation, this is the way it appears before God. I need you to understand this because God is the one that created that blackness. It's the manifestation of Him. It's how He brings the universe into existence according to His will. So by a self-aware creature creating the environment or the possibility where the insignificance of blackness is broadcast, and then it's not just the insignificance, it is the allegations, like an accusation. It's blasphemy. But the only thing that is being broadcast and radiated is a supreme type of ignorance. And simply what that means from a cosmic perspective in front of God is you are basically telling God that you are not fit to be a human being because you are failing the most basic test of what humanity is or what the humanity is supposed to be. Now, this thing that humanity is supposed to be, it exists. It is a prescription. I've told you, the only reason why humanity exists is because God contains self-observational capacity. It exists. It's just what it is. Okay? And so God creates versions of Himself. Okay? And the version that is able to witness God is the human. Because the human must be able to tell itself stories that can capture the glory and the beauty and the goodness of God. The dog cannot do it. The cattle cannot do it. The bear cannot do it. The lion cannot do it. The human is the vehicle that does that. And it is still evolving to be able to do this. And blackness is the means via which this has occurred. So if you now turn around and you say that blackness is antithetical to the human, in fact, you have people who are calling for the extermination of black people because they are useless. Do you not realize what you're saying? Do you not realize what your posture signifies? You are under judgment. By saying that alone, by posturing like that alone, you are under a severe type of judgment. But you don't know because you cannot see the consequences. And that's how I end this podcast. Because what is the mechanistic thinking? The mechanistic thinking is that you go from A to B to C to D. And while you are doing that, you are unaware that the alphabet stretches to Z. You are discovering it step by step. Okay? So you can imagine it as a light within the mind that is growing gradually. And as the light grows, as it increases, different connections are being revealed. But they're not connections outside of you. They're connections of you. Because after all, you are the one experiencing this. The Africans don't start off from that. Their basic thinking already understands that there is A to Z because that is the nature of the environment. They have always seen it like that. It is the theater as it appears in front of their eyes all the time. Life is dynamic. It's hard to really trace where something starts, where it begins, because the reality is complex. Different parts of the environment are interacting with different parts of the environment in ways that are not easily discernible as a straight line. There is robustness, diversity. There are interactions on many hierarchical levels. And each level gives birth to a set of novelty. And they're all intermingling together, all interwoven together. That's the basic experience of the ancestral African from the moment they began to understand themselves as humans. Do you understand what I'm saying? So these paths, with these mental postures, they lead to different types of thinking, the ways to think about different things. Okay? So the European wants a solution to survival. And so he goes and says, okay, fine. In order to make everything simple, I have to reduce it to simplicity. And that means taking nature and creating a toy model out of it. Stripping away all the complexities because I can't really understand them. until I arrive at a very simplified version of reality. And then I use that to do physics. And so the same thing is applied to solving basic problems. Okay, I want to be able to go from here to here. I invent something. And necessity is the mother of invention. You only invent what you need, what you are under pressure to. It's the way everything works. The idea that, because Africans didn't invent guns and missiles, then it means that they are stupid. This is nonsense. You invented guns and missiles because your environment was calling for that. You are in conflict with other people. You are struggling for everything. Well, people who are not struggling like that, they don't develop that type of philosophy. Okay? People who have a different notion of reality, especially one that is complex, they don't engage in certain types of things. Alright? Now, as you look for different solutions to different problems, right? It's a good thing in the sense that you are finding different solutions to different problems. But there's one problem, is that now you have come up with many solutions to different types of problems. You have created many tools, but altogether you have created nonsense. Why? Because it's a huge mess. There's a tool for this, a tool for that, a tool for this. Reality does not exist like that. Reality is a unified whole. That's why you have the transition that is trying to occur now. So, you must create things in a way that they are recyclable. So you must recycle and things like that. It won't work. You can't recycle mechanistic thinking. Okay? You have to change the thinking itself. And that way you won't create the need for things to be recycled. They would naturally be recycled. You won't even need to define recycling or the need for it. The thinking itself contains the necessity for that thing because that's how nature works. So you have to think more like nature. And thinking more like nature means thinking in complex ways, organized complexity. Otherwise, you will not survive. Because even though you have unique environments on Earth, they are all part of one climate. And the overall climate on Earth that nature prefers for the maintenance and the sustenance and the growth of life is not the mechanistic one. It's not the environment that reduces things to the barest minimum so that you can control them easily. For instance, you want to achieve something. I say, okay, well, you just kill these people here and take this. You destroy this place and take that and kill all this, massacre all this and take. Yes, you found a solution. But what type of solution is that? It is a solution that strips nature into the barest. You literally invent a monster. Now, what I'm saying is that no matter how much you invent or what you invent, if it's not the way that reality operates, you have created a problem. And you have not created a problem for anybody. You have created a problem for yourself. Because that reality is not outside of you. And because of that, that reality constrains you. So limitation leads to limitation and on it goes. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because if you look at modern science, now modern science is trying to enter into the realm of complex systems. It doesn't know how to. It's trying to take the mechanistic science and then to translate it into complex systems, and it doesn't know how to. It's not even possible. Because to do that means that it's like the problems encountered in tracking the weather. Right now you have supercomputers that take in all the data. They can predict the weather maximum 7 days in advance. Now, after that 7 days or thereabouts, the predictive models begin to break down. They become less certain. Why? Because of chaos. Because in order to be able to create those models, you are running numerical simulations. Why? Because the mathematical modeling of reality involves an abundance of partial differential equations in many unknowns. There's no system that knows how to solve it. There's no mathematics that is known to be able to solve these types of equations. Because if you can capture all the data in these equations, then you have literally recreated the thing you are trying to model. So it is fiendishly complex and impossible to solve. So systems of approximation are used, and these are numerical simulations. But the thing about chaos is that chaos is always talking about a sensitivity dependence to initial conditions. So once initial conditions, once they change by a tiny little bit, you may not notice anything in the beginning, but over time the solutions begin to diverge. Meaning that since you are doing numerical simulations, the processors that are doing it, they are making approximations in the mathematics and the computation. Gradually over time, those approximations, they begin to become amplified and they begin to deviate from the model. So errors get amplified gradually over time. And all of a sudden, at some point, the errors may just scale up into something big. That's why climate models, that's why they suffer. Because the climate, just like the weather, these are complex systems. They're not really open to the mechanistic view. You cannot track every molecule and every particle and because you will never be able to derive the weather from that. The patterns of the weather are built on a level much higher than that. Okay? Now, the mechanistic form of thinking, it developed because the human needed to survive in an environment that presented those types of challenges and those types of problems. But they have their limitations. Why? Because once you leave that environment, these solutions are no longer solutions. And you have to pay attention to the environment that is demanding that. They're not the ideal environment on Earth. Because anytime the Earth is enveloped by an ice age, it's like the entire planet grinds to a halt where life is concerned. The planet begins to struggle. Life begins to struggle on the planet. So heaven forbid that this ice age type of thinking becomes the dominant thing on the planet. That means the planet is dying in terms of it's holding on by a thread. Life is holding on, okay? But in the modern era, the mechanistic form of thinking has been amplified to cover the entire globe. The African has been suppressed, his way of thinking suppressed, everything about his reality is suppressed. In fact, he's been packaged as a non-entity, a nonsensical human being that really is like the publication is that the African has no use, no right to exist, nothing. You hear a lot of racist memes that say nothing ever came out of it. They didn't even invent a will or a written language. These are nonsensical things. The African's mind is operating on a level of awareness that the European is only just becoming aware of. And they've been like that for tens of thousands of years. Now, what do you think if the mechanistic type of thinking leads to inventions like computers, aeroplanes, all these things, right? What do you think the non-mechanistic form of thinking leads to? Because you think it leads to nothing. It leads to nothing at all. No inventions, no nothing. You are very wrong. It leads to a type of thinking whereby the human being is thinking just like God. Because the intelligence of God is what we are witnessing as creation. And that's how the human being must think, because that is the aim of the theater of experience. That's why we are all here. And that's why we are all in this type of environment, because that environment contains the things that we need to know to be able to understand who God is, to start our journey towards the Maker, to start our ascent. The aim of that is that, like the aim of any intelligence, is that at some point in time, you become aware enough, you become ascended enough, you can create life and it will be good. The mechanistic form of thinking is trying to invent artificial intelligence as life. Do you have any idea what that is? You think people know what they're doing? They don't know what they're doing. You have no idea what you're doing. And I've been saying this for a very, very long time. If I told you that my book contains all the developments in AI, all the potential, literally, listen, I don't want to keep going over and over this because it seems like, you can feel the pain in my voice because of what has been denied. So it's like taking the knowledge of somebody and pushing them aside, okay? It's a very painful thing, but I don't mind because obviously it's part of something else that is evolving. Because I cannot be denied. My knowledge cannot be denied. It's impossible to steal from me, even though it looks like it. But it's part of a much wider developing narrative because everything will be returned, okay? That's really what it is. So most of the knowledge of Africa, and I'm going to share this with you because it's not widely known. The kind of knowledge that exists in Africa, it will shock the entire world what the Africans know, but they hide it. It's a secret, a big secret. Do you know why? Because the part of it that is not hidden, it is creating a lot of problems. Why? Because Africa has changed. Africa has been changed by its neighbors, the Europeans. They've come into Africa and they have changed everything about Africa, including the African mentality. The mechanistic form of thinking has pervaded every aspect of this planet, and you don't know what I'm talking about until you understand the danger of what that is. Africans thinking like that is very dangerous, okay? Because the knowledge of Africa, the knowledge that Black Africans have regarding this cosmos, this universe, it's so hidden, so well guarded. Even many Africans don't even know that such a thing exists, but it's there. It informs, you would think that high knowledge or high understanding, that it's meant to be surrounded by riches. You don't know what you're talking about. That's the mechanistic way of thinking. The aim of knowledge is so that you become aware of God. Because it's not knowledge. What is knowledge? All knowledge comes from your environment. So if at the highest knowledge you are literally understanding how God created the universe, that's the maximum you can do. You can understand how God created you as a human being. You can understand it precisely. Those African civilizations, I was telling somebody the other day, I said, do you not realize that where you have the ancient Nile Valley civilization, that's what it's called now, right? But you have it at the only land bridge outside of Africa, at that place you call Egypt today. And you cross that place, you go into the Sinai, the places, like you're heading towards Arabia and all that. Well, that's the only land bridge outside of Africa. Do you know the importance of that? It's a strategic chokehold. It's a strategic point. And it is there that Africans built a civilization. Why? It's for the same reason why when you go to a foreign country, the first place, if you're traveling by air, the first place you land at is at the airport. that airport is the first taste of that country that you're going to have. And so the airport is designed in a way to give you an impression of the country you have arrived in. Like, for instance, if you're going to Germany, you fly into Frankfurt. Well, it's a beautiful airport, and the way that it is designed, or you fly into Charles de Gaulle or whatever, the way that it is designed is meant to give you a flavor of what the culture of the people or the way that they are. That's why they have built that airport that way. It's like your first impression. Well, on that strategic land bridge, when you come in, the first thing you do is you meet the civilization that used to be called Kemet, an African civilization. So don't you think that this is some type of landing station or welcoming party? But just like you have border security and control at airports, why? Because foreign agents or foreign people are coming into the country. Well, if you're going to prevent some nefarious activity, that's the first place to start, right? So the same type of thinking, that civilization also acted as a kind of security station for foreigners that are coming into Africa. But imagine tens of thousands of years ago, and you're a foreigner, you're coming into Africa, and you meet this civilization. You don't even know what you're looking at. You'll be so overtaken. What is this? I mean, you have structures that are hundreds of meters high. There's no such thing anywhere in the world. Who are these people? It gives you a clear insight into where you have come into. You have come into the land of the black people. And that means you have come into a reality, completely different reality, that is built on the nature of complexity. And complexity simply means that there are many relationships between things. Many of them are not obvious, even though they are there. In order to understand these complex relationships, that's the nature of enlightenment. That's what's being applied in science today. And out of that, technology is being extracted. It's just that the technology is being used for evil. And that conditions the type of thing that is known. Okay? Because if you have knowledge, but you do not have the knowledge of how to use that knowledge in a way that is good, then you have not had any knowledge.